out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
In the mist-laden streets of Nettleport, shadows stretched long across the cobblestones as if echoing the unseen horrors below. The adventurers, Zora, the stalwart half-elf barbarian, Zirath, the ever-watchful dragonborn paladin, and Thalia, the cunning tabaxi warlock, along with a new companion known as Jezebel, the monk of the open hand, had just emerged victorious from a brutal confrontation beneath the city's surface. There, they had rescued young Bran, a bare-knuckle boxer whose innocence had been chained to the underworld of the Nettleport Seasnakes. Gregor the Grinder, a living legend in the arena of pain and punishment, had nearly shattered their resolve with bone-crushing blows and relentless fury. But together, the party fought like a hurricane unleashed, each strike, each spell a testament to the bond they had forged in battle. Zirath's armour dented under Gregor's massive fists like an immovable wall. Thalia's eldritch blasts sliced through the dim haze of the underground ring, and Zora, driven by primal rage, delivered the final blow with a roar that silenced the fight. When the dust settled, Gregor lay broken. The victory, however, was more than blood and triumph. It was revelation. In the hidden depths of the sea snake's domain, they unearthed a trove of coded ledgers tucked away in the office of a corrupt overseer. Friz had deciphered part of their contents, her sharp mind unravelling the cryptic writing with a sense of dread fascination. Among the veiled accounts and illegal dealings, one clue stood out: cash between cowboys and crabbers. At first it seemed like nonsense, but when Zora traced a calloused finger over their map of the Verdun province, their destination became clear. Cowboys meant Tanner Town. Crabbers worked mostly here in Nettleport. Between was Bridgerton, the city of the Great Stone Bridge, a marvel that stretched for miles across a river as wide as the eye could see. A city of wealth and prestige, where the guilds of engineers and merchants had created a miracle of locks and channels, controlling the river's every breath and heartbeat. Zora, Zirath, and Thalia knew what lay ahead would be perilous. The code hinted at more than smuggled goods. It suggested ties to the provincial guard themselves. If they could infiltrate the underbelly of Bridgerton, perhaps they would find not only answers about the sea snake's reach, but also gold. Gold to fund their dangerous lifestyle. Gold to pay debts, both old and new. The adventurers departed Nettleport under a waning crescent moon, the crisp night air carrying the faint scent of salt and pine. From a bustling Travellers' Guild stall near the city's edge, they secured passage across the province with 3 sturdy horses. The Guild's rental system was a marvel of logistical ingenuity. Any traveller with coin could rent a horse and leave it at another Guild-operated stall at their destination. It was a system that kept Verdun's vast territories connected, ensuring swift mobility for merchants, messengers, and adventurers alike. Their horses were well fed and fitted with saddlebags stocked with grain for the journey. The road ahead stretched like a serpent through the wilderness, but something about the journey felt off. Despite it being summer, the air clung to an unnatural chill, as if autumn had crept in unbidden. Deeper into the province, sudden gusts of cold wind lashed at their cloaks and armour. The icy gusts, too bitter for the season, forced them to build larger fires than normal. Thalia muttered to herself about the land being unsettled, her eyes narrowing as if the darkness beyond the campfire held secrets. Zirath, silent but watchful, seemed to share her unease. His homeland was much warmer. They crossed paths with trade caravans hauling goods northward, the caravaneers exchanging grim news as they passed. Timber from Cedar Crest floated down the rivers on colossal rafts, while merchants spoke of rising tensions in the province. Trade routes were becoming treacherous, hampered not only by disputes, but by unnatural weather that threw their schedules into chaos. Over time, the road took on a familiar rhythm. Days blurred into a steady march, punctuated by hunting, fires, and quiet camaraderie. Zora, Zirath, and Thalia often worked together to catch game, their campfires alive with the aroma of roasting meat. One evening, Zora produced a portion of spiked tentacula from their encounter in the marshlands, a battle none of them would soon forget. With a satisfied smirk, he skewered the spiny flesh over the fire and offered it to his companions. Thalia recoiled immediately, her expression leaving no doubt about her disdain. The idea of eating a swamp monster was clearly unthinkable to her. Zirath showed no more enthusiasm, giving Zora a long, disapproving glance before returning to his meditations. Zora's only response was a hearty chuckle as he tore into the tentacle, his grin widening as he declared to himself that this just meant more for him. Thalia sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and crackle. For someone who had always lived independently, she reflected on how different things had become with these two at her side. Zora's fierce, untamed energy and Zirath's calm, stoic resolve seemed to ground her in ways she had never anticipated. She found herself wondering if this bond, this trust, was what others sought in companions. It felt unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. As the firelight played across their features, Thalia mused that they were an unusual group, their presence together almost surreal. Zora's booming laughter was as warm as the fire itself, a sound that carried reassurance rather than mockery. He believed that being strange was an advantage in their line of work. Zirath, though characteristically brief, seemed to agree with the sentiment. His posture relaxed as if acknowledging the truth in those words. Strange or not, their shared trials had forged a bond that transcended simple partnership. For a moment the cold winds receded, leaving only the gentle warmth of the fire. It wrapped around them like an unspoken promise. Whatever awaited them in Bridgerton, they would face it together. Tonight, however, they allowed themselves a fleeting respite beneath the vast starlit sky. Night had fully settled by the time Bridgerton's lights shimmered on the horizon. The adventurers urged their weary horses forward, the animals' hooves clopping steadily as they approached the outskirts of the large town. At the Travellers' Guild stall near the entrance, they dismounted and handed the horses over to the stablemaster. The guild's system ran like clockwork. Records logged, coin exchanged, and the party left free to navigate the city on foot. Bridgerton was not quite a city, but far larger than most towns they had passed through. Between 30,000 and 40,000 people lived there, the population fluctuating with seasonal trade. It served as a key hub for dignitaries, magistrates, and guild masters who preferred conducting business outside the political entanglements of Central City. The heart of Bridgerton revolved around its famed bridge, an architectural marvel and a vital artery for trade throughout Verdun. Zirath's eyes swept over the lines of guards stationed along key streets and near the bridge. Their numbers were remarkable, but he saw the reasoning behind it. The bridge, maintained by the Great Works Guild, spanned the massive river and allowed for precise control of its waterways through a complex system of locks and dams. It was a lifeline for trade, and its protection from brigands, thugs, and wandering monsters was paramount. The town's engineers, masons, and skilled labourers were some of the best in the province, all working to keep the bridge and its infrastructure running like clockwork. As they walked further into the town, Zora noticed how the architecture reflected the town's wealth and long-standing importance. The building's foundations were old, weathered by time, but the upper levels were newer and more refined, built upward rather than outward. Space near the river was a precious commodity, and merchants and artisans had clearly invested in better shops and homes higher off the ground. Zora imagined the endless tunnels beneath their feet, channels carved out to manage the river's flow and power the locks. He knew from experience that places like this, with wealth stacked on wealth, often hid dark secrets below the surface. This thought was not lost on the others. The prosperous trade and intricate infrastructure made Bridgerton a perfect environment for criminal syndicates. Thalia's sharp eyes darted toward the alleys and tunnels in the distance. Zora shared her concern, knowing full well that wherever valuable goods moved, there would always be those seeking to take their share through less than legal means. They had reason to worry. Their fight with the Seasnakes in Nettleport had likely earned them some notoriety. Zora, ever the realist, mused to himself that their names were probably on some list by now. Gangs didn't easily forget a humiliating defeat. Still, they had little choice but to press forward. Their only lead was the cryptic message from the coded ledger, and they would need more information to decipher its meaning. As they passed under the towering shadow of the bridge, the town stretched before them in a maze of shops, inns, and taverns. They agreed to start with the largest inn, a sensible place to gather rumours and rest their bodies after the long journey. Their gold from the last adventure would cover a decent room, and Zora saw no reason to deny himself a bit of comfort. Thalia seemed to agree, her fatigue evident, but her eyes bright with anticipation for the night's possibilities. Zirath, as ever, expressed no strong opinion, quietly following their lead. The streets were still bustling with late-night activity, though the energy was beginning to fade as shopkeepers shuttered their doors and lanterns flickered in the cool night breeze. The warmth of an inn and a fire called to them as they moved deeper into the heart of Bridgerton. Yet beneath the comforting glow of the city lights, they all felt it, the weight of secrets and danger lurking just out of reach. The inn loomed before them like a castle of wealth and privilege, its 5 floors rising proudly above the surrounding buildings. Each floor was a symbol of status. The higher the level, the more luxurious and exclusive it became. In the lamplight, its stone facade shimmered, the windows glowing warmly with hints of opulence behind them. Inside, the lobby sprawled in 2 distinct sections. One side, polished and welcoming, catered to everyday travellers with modest needs, while the other exuded grandeur. Plush seating areas lined with velvet cushions surrounded a roaring hearth. Silver trays laden with mulled wine and rare spirits glimmered under chandeliers. Well-dressed guests lounged with an air of quiet importance, their hushed conversations blending into a soft hum of wealth and refinement. The adventurers pushed through the heavy oak doors, and immediately all eyes turned their way. Dirt and road dust clung to their armour and clothes, and their rugged presence clashed starkly with the finery around them. Zora adjusted the strap of his weapon, unfazed by the stares. Thalia, however, let out a quiet breath and cast a sidelong glance at her companions. She couldn't help but think that Zora and Zirath, with their imposing height and armour, were going to draw attention in a place like this, attention they didn't need right now. They wandered further into the lobby, trying to act natural, but they were anything but subtle. The clothing shops had closed hours ago, and their travel-worn attire did them no favours. When they approached some of the staff with their peculiar questions, ones about hidden caches, gang networks, and bridge infrastructure, eyebrows raised, and whispers followed in their wake. The polished demeanour of the staff barely masked their confusion, and it became clear that the adventurers' presence was causing ripples of curiosity and suspicion among the other guests. Thalia's sharp eyes soon landed on a man seated alone in a corner of the room. His clothing, though elegant, seemed to wear him rather than the other way around. He sat perfectly still, eyes unfocused, as though lost in thought. More tellingly, no one occupied the tables around him. It was as if an invisible barrier of deference, or perhaps fear, had been erected around his space. Thalia's instincts flared. He was out of place here, and she suspected he knew more than he let on. She began to consider her approach, mentally preparing to charm her way into a conversation with him. Before she could act, a figure emerged from the crowd with the fluid grace of someone used to commanding attention without forcing it. The man was middle-aged, handsome, and impeccably dressed in tailored attire that spoke of both wealth and service. His eyes twinkled with a knowing charm as he addressed the party, his voice smooth and practiced. He inquired whether they would be staying for the night, and suggested that they must be weary from the road. He complimented their courage and hinted that adventurers such as themselves deserved nothing less than the finest rooms available. His words were polished yet warm, perfectly towing the line between hospitality and flattery. Zora, ever practical and tired of the stairs, accepted the offer without hesitation. A good room and a warm bed sounded far more appealing than the suspicion-filled atmosphere they currently endured. Thalia and Zirath, however, exchanged glances. Something about the concierge put them on edge. His charm was effortless, perhaps too effortless, and they couldn't shake the feeling that he had approached them for reasons beyond simple customer service. Gold exchanged hands, and the concierge shook Zirath's hand in a gesture of respect. As their hands separated, Zirath felt the subtle pressure of a folded note slipping into his palm. The man's expression never faltered, his demeanour remaining professional and unreadable. He bowed slightly and gestured for the adventurers to follow, promising that their rooms would be prepared without delay. The three of them followed his lead, tension simmering just beneath the surface. Thalia's tail flicked slightly as she kept one eye on the mysterious man seated in the corner. The concierge had interrupted her before she could act, but perhaps it was just as well. The city was already revealing its layers, and it seemed their arrival had not gone unnoticed. Zirath, without a word, carefully folded the note into his fist. The message would have to wait until they were alone. For now they needed to learn the rules of this game, one that had clearly already begun. Who was this man? A friend? A foe? His polished smile and elegant charm gave nothing away, yet the ease with which he had approached them and the secrecy of the note unsettled them. Thalia's mind raced, considering every possibility. Was he a member of the underground network they feared might control Bridgerton's trade? Or perhaps someone from a rival faction watching the bridge? Zirath kept his expression stoic, but his heightened senses told him that the concierge was no ordinary host. Zora, more focused on the promise of rest, still couldn't entirely shake the feeling that this man knew far more than he let on. They were on edge now as they followed him up the marble staircase, the soft footfalls of their guide echoing eerily in the opulent silence. Each of them prepared for the possibility that this encounter was more than it seemed. The concierge led them up the marble staircase to the third floor, a wing lined with polished wood, tapestries, and fine sconces that cast a warm golden glow across the walls. Everything screamed wealth and refinement, but none of the adventurers paid the decor much attention. Zora and Zirath still had their hands resting cautiously on their weapons, while Thalia's eyes never wavered from the concierge. The man, however, remained unflappable, smiling with a practiced charm as though he hadn't just escorted 3 dusty, armed strangers through a crowd of Bridgerton's elite. The concierge, still the image of professionalism, unlocked the door to their suite with an ornate key, its surface etched with strange filigree. He gestured grandly, as if presenting the entrance to a royal palace. He asked politely if they needed anything. Extra pillows, perhaps. Mulled wine. Maybe a dagger-proof mattress. Then, with effortless grace, He pivoted to charming small talk, casually asking what brought them to Bridgerton. The trio stumbled over an improvised and painfully bad story involving trade, family business, and an exaggerated interest in riverboat engineering. The concierge's expression shifted just slightly, his smile thinning ever so politely. He tilted his head, nodded, and with a dry, sarcastic tone that carried the barest hint of amusement, remarked that their story was absolutely fascinating. He gave a slow, thoughtful pause as if savouring the absurdity before closing the door behind them. But he didn't leave, and instead the concierge leaned against the now closed door, his smile disappearing like a magician's trick. His eyes darkened with a sharp, cutting seriousness. He wasted no time asking the real question. Were they truly that stupid, or just looking to get murdered and dumped into the river by the city's charmingly corrupt guards? For a long moment silence reigned. Then Zirath sighed internally. Great, he thought. Another warlock. A subtle dark power rippled around the concierge, flowing like shadows at the edge of perception. Thalia immediately caught the shift in energy but didn't ask the obvious question. Warlocks had a code. They didn't pry into one another's pacts. The man introduced himself at last. He was Thomas, a warlock and a professional thief. His features sharpened as his expression hardened. He repeated the question with steel in his voice. Why were they really here? His gaze flicked between them, weighing their response like a judge awaiting a confession. The adventurers glanced at one another before deciding on honesty. They told him about the cryptic clue from the Seasnakes' ledger and their hunch that Bridgerton was hiding something bigger. Thomas studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, in a hushed tone, he explained what he knew. For months he had been gathering information under the guise of a concierge. He left what happened to the last concierge out of the story. Charm and well-placed spells had gotten him far, but his cover had nearly been blown the moment they walked into the lobby looking like wild mercenaries who'd just survived a mudslide. He assured them that these rooms were safe. No listening ears. He had been casing the entire city for months and had uncovered troubling signs. The guard captain was deeply corrupt, a man who had been accepting bribes for years. He controlled access to the crucial bridge mechanisms and had been quietly suppressing evidence from honest guards who had tried to investigate. Thomas suspected there was something of immense value hidden beneath the city, something worth killing for. As if that weren't enough, Bridgerton was crawling with dignitaries and wealthy visitors, far more than usual. Thomas believed something significant was being moved into the city, and both the Seasnakes and the guard were involved. What wasn't clear was who was truly in charge. Who was pulling the strings and why? There was too much muscle in town for a straightforward approach. That's where they came in. Thomas had been looking for people reckless enough to join him in a heist. He needed partners, and it appeared fate had delivered 3 ambitious, gold-hungry adventurers to his doorstep. He asked if they were in. For a moment the trio paused, considering the danger ahead. But then, as if by instinct, their thoughts drifted toward the promise of riches. Zora imagined the weight of coin in his palm. Thalia's eyes gleamed with curiosity and ambition, and Zirath remained stoic. But even he couldn't deny the practical appeal of funding their costly journey. The gang was together. They were in. Thomas wasted no time outlining his grand, harebrained scheme. It was risky, convoluted, and, of course, required them to be in 3 places at once. As he described it, Zora folded his arms and raised a brow, while Zirath rubbed his temple. Thalia, however, listened with a growing sparkle of interest. This was shaping up to be exactly the kind of chaotic opportunity she loved. The first piece of the plan revolved around a water pump station. Apparently, Thomas had overheard some drunken guards, heavily encouraged by him via a few rounds of strong drink, repeatedly mention one particular station out of the dozens scattered throughout the city. Sensing something odd, he later bribed a debt-ridden engineer, whose debt, Thomas casually admitted, he had a hand in creating, to reveal some juicy details. The station had a second set of controls, hidden and ancient, which could open a massive, solid slab door, something built with the kind of weight and secrecy that screamed vault. Next, Thomas recounted his dinner date with a city magistrate clerk, a tale complete with romantic overtones and well-timed eyelash batting. The story earned a long-suffering eye-roll from Zirath, who clearly had little patience for such tactics. Thomas had charmed the clerk into sharing the story of a high-profile city guardsman and chief interrogator who had resigned in protest. The guard had quit after 3 major cases were suspiciously dropped by the captain, cases that likely connected to whatever lay behind that mysterious door. Finally, Thomas revealed his pièce de résistance, a high-stakes, illegal card game. He had meticulously organized it to lure in the guard captain, known for his gambling addiction. The game was set to take place in a makeshift speakeasy, guaranteed to attract wealthy thrill-seekers, off-duty guards, and corrupt city officials. The captain's frequent appearances at these games gave him a convenient, if laughable, excuse for his inexplicable wealth. Thomas needed a crew to keep the game going all night, both as a distraction and as bait. The plan required precise coordination. One crew had to ensure the card game didn't fall apart. Someone else had to break into the water pump station, access the hidden controls, and open the vault door. Meanwhile, another person would have to infiltrate the guard captain's office on the 3rd floor of the barracks. With most of the guards drawn to either the streets or the game, it would be the perfect window, assuming everything didn't go horribly wrong. With a theatrical spin and a curt wave, Thomas informed them that it was all going down the very next day. He told them to get some rest, adding that he'd meet them behind a local apothecary in the morning. He needed to barter for a few substances that, as he put it, helped a man in his line of work. Zora raised a brow at the implication, but Thomas didn't stick around long enough for questions. As the door clicked shut behind him, the 3 adventurers stood in silence, digesting the insanity they had just signed up for. Thalia's tail twitched in amusement. Zora stared out the window and quietly wondered how his life had led to this moment. Zirath muttered something under his breath, possibly a prayer for patience. They all had the same unspoken thought. What in the hell had they agreed to? The plan came together in an alley behind the most unpleasant shop in Bridgerton, a place so foul-smelling that even the seediest types steered clear of it. The source of the stench was painfully obvious, large vats of riverfish remedies, whatever that entailed. Zora, despite his best efforts, was lurching with every breath, his face twisted in agony. Zirath stood stoically, though his discomfort showed in the way his tail subtly flicked with agitation. Thalia's heightened senses betrayed her. She swore the smell clung to her fur like an unrelenting curse. She couldn't resist a jab, quietly commenting that the alley reeked suspiciously, like Zora's beloved tentacular snack. Zora, to her disbelief, simply grinned and muttered something about craving another bite. Thomas eventually arrived, looking far too smug with a nose plug firmly in place. He offered an almost sincere apology for not warning them about the olfactory nightmare, though the glint in his eyes suggested he found their suffering mildly amusing. With the stench temporarily put aside, though not forgotten, they moved to the task at hand. The roles were decided swiftly. Thalia would handle the infiltration of the guard captain's office on the 3rd floor of the barracks. Her nimbleness and knack for slipping through shadows made her the perfect candidate. Zirath would take on the water pump station. Thomas had learned that the night shift attendant was a nervous, wide-eyed recruit who'd barely made it through training. Zirath's imposing presence alone would likely be enough to intimidate him if things went sideways. As for Zora, he would accompany Thomas to the illegal card game, playing the role of his assistant, a term that Zora found mildly insulting until Thomas pointed out that his massive size and presence might deter trouble. Zora didn't entirely mind. With luck, his main job would be standing around looking menacing while sipping on expensive drinks. The plan was all about timing. Sunset would mark the start of the operation. As the gamblers filed into the speakeasy and the corrupt guards left their posts for a night of indulgence, the younger, less capable recruit would take over at the pump station. Each of them had to be in position and execute their role perfectly. One mistake, and the entire heist would collapse like a house of cards. Thomas, noseplug still securely in place, reminded them that there was no room for error. When they finished, they would meet back here behind the shop. Zora groaned softly at the thought of returning to the fish-scented alley, but no one dared risk meeting in a less discreet location. As the three adventurers prepared to head off, the tension shifted to resolve. They were in too deep to back out now. Sunset loomed like a countdown, and with it, the moment they'd either score big or go down in flames. Off they went, each steeling themselves for the tasks ahead. In the warehouse district, Zora and Thomas made their way through the darker streets of Bridgerton, arriving at the abandoned granary near the edge of the business district. It was a nondescript structure, blending in with the other aging buildings around it. The only clue that anything unusual was going on was the lone sentry standing at the door, his lance gleaming under the dim street lamps. Thomas strolled up with his usual air of casual arrogance and leaned in just enough to whisper the password, "Fish oil soup." The guard tapped the butt of his lance against the ground 3 times, and a hidden door creaked open. Zora shot Thomas a sidelong glance but said nothing. He was already wondering if this was going to be as ridiculous as it sounded. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Music, laughter, and the scent of expensive spirits filled the air. The warehouse had been transformed into a lively speakeasy, complete with dancing patrons and elegantly dressed gamblers sipping from crystal glasses. Zora scanned the room, taking in the scene. Thomas muttered under his breath, quietly marvelling at how people would pay triple the normal price for drinks just because they believed it was all part of some thrillingly illegal experience. The drinks weren't illegal at all, of course, but the illusion was apparently enough to draw these thrill-seekers. Zora considered this and reflected that it made a strange kind of sense. Dreamers and thrill-chasers craved the appearance of danger without the risk, whereas adventurers like him lived on the edge of real peril every day. That, he supposed, was what separated them. At the back of the speakeasy, another door awaited, guarded by a different sentry. Another password, trout pie dinner. And Zora couldn't suppress the smallest smirk. Fish-related passwords again? It struck him as oddly fitting, considering he'd once been a fisherman before turning to a life of adventure. He shook his head as the door opened, silently resigning himself to this surreal chain of events. The room beyond was quieter, filled with tension rather than noise. At its centre stood a large, well-lit card table, surrounded by a few already seated players. Hired muscle lingered around the perimeter of the room, their eyes tracking every movement with the professionalism of seasoned bodyguards. The dealer at the table gave Thomas a curt nod, a silent recognition of his role here. Zora immediately assessed the situation, noting that the dealer looked like someone who'd be well compensated for his discretion tonight. The players themselves were a colourful and suspiciously wealthy lot. Seated at the table was a male human guard captain, his too fine clothing and gaudy rings practically screaming corruption. Next to him sat a cattle baron from Tanner Town, his leathers tailored and polished to an absurd degree. On the opposite side of the table was a female human art collector from Inkwell, her attire elaborate and her fingers adorned with delicate jewellery. A halfling woman in fine but practical clothing, likely the owner of a logging company from Cedar Crest, watched the proceedings with a cool expression, her drink untouched. Finally, there was a male, half-elf magistrate from Central City, his presence marked by an air of quiet authority and suspicion. Thomas shot a quick glance at Zora, his expression silently saying, "Look intimidating. Say nothing," before stepping forward to take his place at the table. Zora sighed, but followed without a word, settling into his role as Thomas's assistant. His imposing frame drew more than a few wary glances from the players, but none of them questioned his presence. It was shaping up to be a long, dangerous night, and possibly a profitable one. Thalia's journey to the guard barracks felt longer than it actually was. The route took her through Bridgerton's quietest quarter, near the great bridge where the river shimmered dark and cold under the moonlight. Few lived in this part of town. Most of the buildings were government offices, warehouses and guild properties. At this late hour, the shops were shuttered, their windows empty of life. The occasional passer-by trudged along, hunched against the evening chill. Their steps hurried and solitary. Thalia wondered briefly if any of them were also up to no good, though few had her level of ambition tonight. She kept her hood pulled low and her cloak wrapped tightly around her, blending into the cold shadows of the deserted streets. The evening air nipped at her fur, but she welcomed it. With so few people around and even fewer peering from windows, she was free to move unnoticed. As she approached the barracks, she scanned the area carefully, searching for any signs of life. There were none. Just the dull, steady glow of lanterns at the corner posts flickering in the breeze. The barracks loomed ahead, an imposing 3-story structure of stone and reinforced wood. Its barred windows on the first and second floors left few options for subtle entry. Thalia knew that scaling the walls would take too long and risk attracting attention. She needed a faster way inside. Moving like a shadow, she circled the building, sticking to the darker alleys and blind spots. Each window she checked showed only darkness beyond the iron bars. No movement. No guards on patrol. Perfect. Taking a breath to steady her nerves, she approached the main entrance. Lockpicks slid from her belt into her nimble fingers, as if summoned by instinct. Her eyes darted to the street and alleys one last time to ensure she was still alone. The cold metal of the lock greeted her, and she set to work, her hands moving quickly, but with the precision of years of practice. Her mind raced as seconds dragged on, every heartbeat louder than the last. For a moment, the lock resisted, making her stomach tighten. She exhaled slowly, steadying her hand, and adjusted the tension. Then, with a soft click, the mechanism yielded. Relief flooded her senses, but she didn't let her guard down. Thalia eased the door open, its heavy frame barely creaking. Slipping inside like a whisper, she gently closed it behind her and re-engaged the lock. Inside the barracks, silence reigned. The faint scent of leather and metal lingered in the air. She took a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering in from high-barred windows. No guards in sight. So far, so good. Her heart quickened again. Now came the tricky part. She had to get to the 3rd floor without being seen or heard. She moved deeper into the shadows of the corridor, her senses on high alert, every creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet sending a jolt of tension through her body. Step by step, she crept toward the staircase, ears straining for the faintest sign of movement. The mission had only just begun, and there was no turning back. Elsewhere in the town, Zirath made his way to the river's edge, descending through towering stone channels that carved through the city like ancient veins. He had to admit, Verdun engineers knew what they were doing. These structures, with their sheer size and precision, rivaled the great works of the old empires from his continents. Though he rarely spoke of it, his mind wandered to his homeland, where city-states sprawled across landscapes in walks that lasted for days. The memories tugged at his thoughts, and with them came the familiar ache of unresolved vengeance. His grip tightened around his axe as he recalled the massacre of the Bloodfire clan. His oath to avenge them still burned deep in his veins, a fire that refused to die. Snapping himself back to the task at hand, Zirath approached the door of the pump station. He knocked firmly, the sound echoing through the empty river channel. Moments later, a voice answered from behind the door, nervous, cracking slightly under the weight of inexperience. Just perfect, Zirath thought grimly. A child. Feigning authority, he announced himself as a city inspector, complete with an urgent matter that needed immediate attention. The boy stammered a response, saying there was nothing on today's inspection list, and that his shift supervisor had left strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. Zirath tried another approach, claiming he had an important delivery for the day shift. The boy hesitated but ultimately refused again, his voice quaking as he apologized. The exchange continued like a bad comedy routine. Zirath offered a bribe, hoping that might speed things along. The boy, however, seemed entirely too earnest, explaining that he hadn't finished reading the rulebook yet but was pretty sure there was a section about not taking bribes. Zirath's patience wore thinner with every word. The paladin's blood boiled in his ears and he fell silent in a bid to keep himself from shouting. His silence stretched ominously. From behind the door, the boy's voice wavered, asking if the man was still there. Zirath said nothing. The boy called out again, his voice tinged with growing panic. That was when Zirath, unable to endure the nonsense any longer, charged at the door. With the full might of his 7-foot frame, he crashed into it like a battering ram. The door didn't stand a chance. It flew off its hinges with an explosive crack and hit the floor hard. Unfortunately, so did the boy, who had been standing right behind it. Zirath stepped inside and took a moment to survey the damage. The door lay smashed and splintered, and the young attendant was sprawled beneath it, groaning faintly. The absurdity of the scene almost made Zirath sigh aloud. He knelt down, lifted the heavy door off the boy and propped it back into the frame with a grim sense of duty. It wobbled slightly but held. The boy remained on the floor half-conscious and mumbling something about rule violations and possible fines. Zirath pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled slowly. He had planned to intimidate the boy into cooperation, but that option had quite literally been flattened. Now he found himself in a predicament. He was alone in the station, with no one capable of operating the controls. He looked at the series of levers, valves and gauges on the far wall, all labelled with cryptic engineering jargon. The paladin muttered a silent prayer for patience. He would need to figure out how to open the vault door without breaking the entire station, or his sanity. Back at the speakeasy, the card game was well underway, and the personalities of the players had come into sharp focus. The Tannertown cattle baron was a loud, boisterous presence at the table, his booming laughter punctuating every hand. But for all his hearty bluster, he was anything but a fool. His growing pile of coins testified to his shrewd instincts and years of experience navigating both the world of business and high-stakes games. The guard captain, in stark contrast, was reserved and calculating. He played each hand with an almost clinical precision, clearly here with one goal: to win. His quiet intensity made him difficult to read, a man used to control. Meanwhile, the art heiress from Inkwell appeared to treat the entire game as a mild diversion. She was neither desperate to win nor afraid to lose. This detachment made her unpredictable, and Zora could see that it was starting to unnerve the player from Cedarcrest, who had been steadily drowning in her drinks all night. Thomas kept the drinks flowing, an almost invisible hand in the social currents of the room. It was a game in itself. Keep the players lubricated just enough to loosen inhibitions, but not enough to shatter the illusion of control. The Cedarcrest magnate was proving to be his most generous customer so far, and it wasn't doing her strategy any favours. Suddenly, the cattle baron waved Zora over and asked for a drink, something strong. Zora hesitated, momentarily unsure of what the man meant. He hadn't exactly been given bartender duties tonight. The baron's sharp gaze narrowed, and he casually asked where Zora was from. There was something in the man's eyes that told Zora he wouldn't be able to bluff his way through this one. He chose honesty, explaining that he had once been a simple farmer and fisherman. Without warning, the baron grabbed Zora's wrist and turned over his hand, exposing his calloused palm. Every guard in the room tensed, hands drifting toward weapons as the atmosphere crackled with sudden tension. Zora instinctively stiffened, his muscles coiled and ready for a fight. But before anything could escalate, the baron waved off the guards with a chuckle. He pressed his own hand next to Zora's, comparing the rough, scarred skin. The man remarked that those kinds of calluses couldn't be faked. He too had come from a working family and had built his fortune from the ground up before selling off his business to retire. The moment of tension passed as quickly as it had come, and the Baron gave Zora a nod of respect. He asked again for something strong to drink, this time with the air of a man sharing a moment between equals. Zora obliged, fetching the drink while the other players breathed a collective sigh of relief. The game resumed, but it wasn't long before another potential disaster loomed. The Cedar Crest magnate, deep in her cups and clearly frustrated, went all in on a reckless hand. She lost. Badly. Coins clattered to the table as she pushed back her chair and staggered to her feet. Zora could see it plain as day. She was ready to leave, and that would throw the balance of the entire game off. The other players would lose interest without her, and the distraction Thomas had so carefully crafted would unravel. Thomas moved fast. With his signature charm, he intercepted the timber magnate before she could reach the door. Leaning in close, he whispered softly into her ear, his smile dazzling. He offered her the opportunity to continue playing on credit, subtly appealing to both her pride and her competitive spirit. It was a risky move, but Thomas knew exactly how to read people. He could almost see the gears turning behind her eyes as she weighed the offer. After a moment's pause, she grinned, nodded, and sauntered back to her seat with surprising grace for someone as far into her drinks as she was. Thomas gave a small sigh of relief, though his expression never broke from his effortless cool. Two near disasters averted. The game continued, and the tension slowly ebbed as the players refocused on their next moves. Zora stood by, ever watchful, knowing that this night was far from over. Once inside the barracks, Thalia peered through the barred window on the first floor. Her breath held for a moment as she scanned the deserted street outside. No signs of movement, no curtains shifting in nearby windows, no hurried footsteps echoing down the cobblestones. It seemed no one had seen her enter, and she allowed herself a brief moment of pride. Her lockpicking had been swift, nearly as quick as if she had the real key in hand. The barracks on the first floor were as bare and uninspiring as expected. Rows of simple bunk beds stretched across the open space, each one accompanied by a modest trunk and a standard-issue uniform. Spartan and utilitarian, the area offered little of interest. She rummaged quietly, but found nothing beyond the basics: weapons racks, dented armor, and a few personal belongings of the rank-and-file guards. Nothing useful for her mission. The second floor was no better. It contained a small kitchen, a few locked supply closets, and a weapons store. Still, there was no sense of luxury or importance, just functional equipment and storage. Thalia began to wonder if Thomas's information had been exaggerated, but when she climbed the final staircase, her doubts dissolved. The third floor spoke volumes. It was a world apart from the rest of the building, lavishly decorated with opulence that dripped from every corner. Trophies from hunts lined the walls alongside intricately crafted weapons. The carpet underfoot was thick and lush, a deep crimson hue that muffled her footsteps. Golden-framed paintings and expensive draperies adorned the halls. Even the sergeants' offices reflected wealth far beyond the means of a provincial guard's salary. Thalia's sharp mind quickly pieced it together. These sergeants weren't just officers. They were likely hand-picked loyalists of the captain, well compensated to keep in line with his operations. Her eyes travelled to the door at the end of the corridor, a masterpiece of craftsmanship carved from rich redwood imported from Cedar Crest. The captain's insignia, ornate and over-embellished, was emblazoned on its surface. It must have cost a small fortune, and Thalia couldn't help but shake her head at the audacity of such blatant corruption. To display this level of wealth without fear of repercussions spoke volumes about the captain's grip on power. Taking a steadying breath, Thalia approached the door and eased it open, only to hear the unmistakable click of a mechanism. Her instincts kicked in, and she hurled herself to the side just as flames erupted from concealed nozzles around the doorframe. The searing heat roared past her, licking at her cloak but sparing her from the worst of the inferno. She hit the ground hard, her pulse racing. A second slower, and she would have been reduced to ash. Cursing softly, she regained her footing. Of course the door had been trapped. It was too obvious in hindsight. The door had been left unlocked to bait intruders, punishing them with lethal fire while ensuring no alarms were raised. It wasn't meant to alert anyone, just to eliminate and erase evidence of anyone who dared to enter uninvited. Thalia shook off the lingering fear and smirked at the captain's overconfidence. She'd survived, and now it was her turn to explore. The office was as gaudy as the hall outside. Expensive bottles of spirits and fine liquors sat on shelves, alongside rare artifacts used more for decoration than practical value. She searched quickly but methodically. Beneath the captain's desk, hidden only by a thin panel, she found what she was looking for. A pile of records, exactly as Thomas had described. She flipped through the papers, her sharp eyes catching key details. The reports contained damning evidence of criminal activities, corruption, and abuse of power, but the captain's name was conspicuously absent. He had erased his own involvement, leaving the blame to fall squarely on his sergeant underlings. It was blackmail material, no doubt, insurance to keep his closest lieutenants in line. As she continued her search, something else caught her attention. Tucked among the documents were detailed schematics, notes about the vault door at the water pump station. But there was more. A third entrance was marked on the map, this one outside the city. Thalia's mind raced. This was bigger than even Thomas had predicted. Whatever lay behind that door had multiple access points, and someone had gone to great lengths to protect it. Before she could study the map further, a noise from the hallway sent her heart hammering. A faint creak, the telltale sound of someone moving outside the door. Thalia froze, straining to hear. The footsteps were light but deliberate, slowly drawing closer. Someone was out there, and they weren't supposed to be. Her instincts sharpened like a blade. She slid the documents into her satchel and slipped into the shadows of the room. The door to the office remained ajar, the flickering light from the hall casting long, shifting shadows on the floor. She tightened her grip on the dagger hidden beneath her cloak and waited, every muscle tensed like a coiled spring. Zirath, the only conscious person in the room, stared at the labyrinth of controls on the station's wall, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. The levers, gears, and gauges might as well have been written in an alien language. He was no engineer, and this wasn't a puzzle he had the knowledge to solve. He knew he needed help. His eyes drifted to the unconscious boy on the floor. He was alive, barely, and Zirath figured he might be able to make himself useful if woken up. Propping the boy against the wall, Zirath began with a few light taps to his face. The boy didn't stir. Zirath, impatience building, decided a stronger approach was necessary. A full-handed slap followed, accompanied by a roar intended to shock the boy awake. Instead, the boy's body slumped forward, his face hitting the floor with a dull crack. Zirath growled, clearly displeased with the situation. He pulled the boy back upright, shaking him slightly in frustration. That was when he noticed it. The boy's sleeve had rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his arm. A coiled serpent over rolling waves. Recognition hit immediately. The Nettleport Seasnakes. His eyes snapped to the boy's face, and he saw a flash of fury and defiance. Before Zirath could react, the boy's head shot forward with surprising strength, slamming into Zirath's face. Pain exploded across Zirath's vision as he stumbled back, instinctively loosening his grip. In an instant, the boy was on his feet, producing 2 knives seemingly out of thin air. The nervous green recruit was gone, replaced by a hardened killer with deadly intent. Zirath drew his axe, tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. The boy moved first, fast and precise, slashing at Zirath with a flurry of strikes aimed at vital points. Zirath parried the first blow with the haft of his axe and twisted to avoid another aimed for his throat. Sparks flew as steel met steel, each clash echoing ominously in the enclosed space. The rogue's speed was alarming, his movements fluid and relentless. Zirath retaliated with a heavy swing, forcing the boy to retreat. The axe tore through the air, grazing the rogue's uniform as he dodged. The boy countered with a quick feint, his blade grazing Zirath's arm. The sharp sting of pain fueled Zirath's rage, and he roared, driving the rogue back with a series of sweeping strikes. The boy ducked and rolled with agility, his blades flashing in the dim light as he aimed low at Zirath's legs. Zirath narrowly avoided the blow, planting his feet and preparing for the next assault. They circled each other again, both breathing heavily. The rogue's eyes flicked toward his remaining blade, calculating his next move. Zirath could sense the hesitation and knew this was his moment. He lunged forward, axe swinging with brutal force. The rogue blocked with his knife, but the sheer power of the strike sent him stumbling. Zirath didn't relent. He followed with another swing, then another, each one hammering the rogue's defenses. The boy's speed was failing him. His footwork faltered as he struggled to keep up. In a final act of desperation, he lunged forward, aiming for Zirath's ribs. Zirath twisted, deflecting the blow with his axe and catching the boy's wrist in a crushing grip. The knife fell to the ground with a clatter. With a roar of exertion, Zirath spun the boy around and delivered a powerful blow to the back of his head with the axe's pommel. The rogue collapsed to his knees, dazed. Zirath didn't hesitate. He raised his axe and brought it down in a swift, decisive strike. The rogue's body crumpled to the floor, motionless. Zirath stood over the fallen opponent, his chest heaving. Blood trickled from the cut on his arm, but he paid it no mind. The fight was over, but questions still gnawed at him. The Seasnakes had infiltrated the city's infrastructure. Whatever was hidden behind that vault door was clearly worth killing for. He wiped the blade of his axe clean, his gaze hardening. Looking at the crumpled body of the boy, he had an idea. The stakes were impossibly high now. The table had become the center of attention in the speakeasy, with spectators crowding around to witness the game unfold. At least 20,000 gold in coins, promissory notes, and valuables glittered on the table. Among the treasures was a spectacular diamond bracelet, dramatically produced by the Inkwell heiress to stay in the game. The pot shimmered like bait in a trap, tempting even the most disciplined players. The guard captain was leaning forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. His earlier indulgence in spirits had stopped entirely. No more distractions. He was here to win. Thomas, however, wore his signature grin, all charm and cool confidence. But inside, his nerves twisted painfully. His patron's presence loomed in his mind, tugging at him with hunger at the sight of the mountain of wealth before him. The tension in the room grew unbearable. The heiress from Inkwell had been winning far too consistently, and suspicion was settling over the table like a fog. Thomas nudged Zora, subtly drawing his attention. Zora caught it immediately. The heiress's hands moved with practiced grace, subtly removing and switching a card from her deck. The maneuver was nearly imperceptible, a testament to her skill. She wasn't just a bored socialite, she was a performer of the highest order, a product of Inkwell's mastery of illusion and deception. Others at the table began noticing as well. Another hand passed. Another win for the heiress. The guard captain's composure snapped. He stood violently, knocking his chair back. The guards around the room stiffened, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. The room crackled with impending chaos as angry murmurs spread among the spectators. Tension escalated rapidly. Accusations hung in the air unspoken, waiting to ignite. Thomas didn't hesitate. He conjured an illusion, a loud, commanding knock at the door. The sound echoed through the room like thunder, freezing everyone in place. For a moment, silence fell as fear crept into the crowd. Despite the irony, everyone feared a raid, even though the guard captain himself was part of the illegal game. The display of unchecked corruption couldn't have been clearer. The guard captain, tense and visibly frustrated, moved toward the door to investigate. In the lull that followed, Thomas seized his chance. He moved quietly around the table, offering patrons drinks in a disarming manner. While their focus shifted, Zora caught sight of Thomas slipping the diamond bracelet into his pocket with practiced ease. The captain returned moments later, scowling. He announced that the noise had been nothing. For a second, it seemed like order might return, until the drunken Cedar Crest magnate suddenly called out that the bracelet was missing. Every head turned. Voices rose in confusion and suspicion, and within seconds, accusations flew across the table like daggers. Fingers pointed at each other, and then at Thomas and Zora. The guards advanced, eyes narrowing dangerously. Zora's mind raced. He needed to act fast. With a sudden roar, he flipped the entire table, sending gold, notes, and valuables flying in every direction. Coins clattered and rolled across the floor as chaos erupted. Patrons, guards, and hired muscle dove to the ground in a frenzy, scrambling to collect whatever riches they could grab. Thomas gave Zora a nod of approval before the two made their move. Under the cover of the madness, they slipped out the back door, weaving through the still distracted crowd. They pushed past dancing patrons and dazed bystanders in the outer room, keeping their pace brisk but measured until they hit the alleyway. Once outside, they didn't look back. The sound of shouting and confusion faded behind them as they sprinted into the night, adrenaline surging through their veins. Thalia froze as she heard footsteps echoing down the hall, slow and uneven. Her ears twitched, every muscle in her body tensing. The steps were getting closer. Quickly she rushed to the door and shut it as quietly as possible. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A faint click echoed from the other side, followed by a strange muffled giggle. Thalia's mind raced. This wasn't a typical patrol. She moved quickly and silently, slipping into the shadows like a whisper of wind. True to her tabaxi grace, she pulled her dark cloak tightly around her, vanishing into the gloom. No light reflected off her fur or cloak. She was part of the darkness now. The door creaked open and a figure staggered inside. A visibly drunk guard stumbled over the threshold, muttering to himself in a slurred voice. His steps were unsteady, his balance wavering as he leaned against the doorframe for a moment. He rambled incoherently about how the captain and his favoured sergeants always kept the best things for themselves, how they hoarded the fine luxuries while the rest of the guards got scraps. Thalia barely dared to breathe as the guard tottered deeper into the room, his eyes unfocused but scanning the walls. He was mumbling again, this time about the trap on the door. He chuckled under his breath, mentioning something about bullhorns and fire, and how he knew the captain's little secret. His words were fragmented, but they hinted at knowledge of the very trap she had narrowly survived. The guard wandered closer, weaving between the furniture as he admired the room's opulent decor. He muttered more complaints about the obvious corruption, cursing under his breath. His steps grew louder, and Thalia tensed as he came dangerously close. Only a few feet separated them now. He didn't seem to notice her. His drunkenness, combined with her mastery of stealth and the shadowy corner she hid in, rendered her almost invisible. Her heart raced as he lingered just a moment too long near her hiding spot. But the guard's attention shifted to the liquor shelf. He stumbled toward it, muttering something about Gold and Sons rye whiskey, a bottle worth 1,000 gold. With an exaggerated grin, he uncorked it and took a long swig. He shook his head, mockingly thanking the captain for his hospitality and muttering a string of colourful insults under his breath. The guard laughed bitterly to himself as he staggered back toward the door, taking another deep drink. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud. Silence fell over the office once more. Thalia let out a long, slow breath, her body relaxing ever so slightly. That had been far too close. She waited a few moments longer, ensuring the footsteps faded entirely before stepping out of the shadows. Her instincts remained sharp. She could not afford another surprise like that. Time was ticking. Before she made her escape, the buried evidence she had scanned gave her an idea. She made for the first floor and grabbed a few guard uniforms. Quick as a shadow, she made her back up to the third floor, opened a window and made for the street down to an unoccupied alley. It was time to regroup. Zirath stood over the lifeless body of the rogue assassin, his axe still dripping with blood. The room was eerily silent except for the faint hum of machinery. His one and only guide to operating the infernal control system lay dead on the ground, and the pressure of the situation gnawed at his mind. Time was slipping through his fingers, and the vault door had to open soon. He turned to the massive array of levers, wheels, and gauges once more, his jaw tightening in frustration. The controls were a maddening tangle of mechanisms that made no sense to him. Zirath, ever a man of action, grabbed a lever at random and yanked it down. A deep metallic groan echoed throughout the station, causing his scales to prickle with unease. He paused, waiting for something disastrous to happen. When nothing did, he exhaled and tried turning a small wheel to his right. A high-pitched pressure whistle screamed to life, forcing him to cover his ears in irritation. He quickly spun the wheel in the opposite direction until the noise subsided, leaving only the sound of his ragged breathing in the room. His gaze sharpened as he stared at the controls. There had to be a solution, something logical in this nightmare of machinery. He needed a way to bypass the complexity entirely. He focused deeply, mentally dissecting each mechanism, gears spinning in his head but offering no revelation. Then it hit him, a moment of pure brilliance amid the chaos. The control box was made of tin, very soft and delicate tin. The soft metal casing crumpled under the impact of his axe, sparks flying as wires snapped and gears shattered. A slow grin crept across his face, his eyes narrowing with satisfaction. He raised his axe high and brought it down again with the full force of his wrath. He let out a growl of rage and struck again, venting his fury at the absurdity of the entire situation. Another blow followed, and then another, each strike a catharsis for being duped by the assassin, for the ridiculous complexity of the controls, and for the sheer idiocy of sending a paladin to do an engineer's job. After 5 vicious swings, Zirath realized there was nothing left to destroy. The control panel lay in ruins, twisted and broken at his feet. He stood there for a moment, panting, and waiting for the inevitable shriek of alarm whistles or mechanical failure. But none came. The station was eerily silent once more. He came back into focus, shaking his head in disbelief. He supposed the good news was that he hadn't triggered any alarms, but there was also no clear indication that the vault door had opened. His grin faded. Now came the hard part, breaking the news to the rest of the group. With a final glance at the wrecked control system, he muttered to himself that someone else could figure out the aftermath. He hefted his axe and made his way out of the station, resigned to delivering the update that, as usual, brute force had been both a solution and a problem. The crew regrouped in the alley behind the rancid-smelling apothecary, the stench of riverfish remedies making Zora gag once again. Thomas and Zora recounted the events of the card game, explaining how they had slipped out with an incredibly expensive bracelet, while the muscle and patrons were still wrestling over accusations of cheating. Zora added that they had likely bought themselves some time before anyone could piece together exactly what had happened. Then Zirath delivered the bad news. He described the fight with the rogue assassin at the water pump station and admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that the controls were no longer functional. Thomas's eyes narrowed and he crossed his arms as he asked why. Zirath hesitated, finally muttering that it had something to do with his axe. Thomas groaned loudly, lamenting the months of groundwork he had put into this plan, now apparently shattered by one bad day and a lot of misplaced rage. Before the mood could sink any further, Thalia stepped in with a grin. She pulled out the evidence she had gathered from the guard captain's office and laid it all out. Among the reports and blackmail material was a crucial discovery: another entrance to the vaults beneath a tree stump outside the city. She drew the location on a map that Thomas produced from his coat. Thomas eyed the spot with a grimace, clearly displeased. He muttered that nothing good ever started with outside the city. Thalia then revealed another plan. She had smuggled out a few guard uniforms and proposed that Thomas wear one, posing as a corrupt guard escorting prisoners. Zora, Zirath and Thalia would play the role of captives while their gear was hidden in a pack. It was risky, yes, but it was also their only shot to get into the thieves' hideout undetected. The others agreed, albeit with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The group made their way into the woods outside the city under the cover of night. The air was cooler, and a soft fog clung to the forest floor as they reached the location marked on the map. They dressed for the part, donning the uniforms and concealing their weapons and supplies. As they searched the clearing, Zora found the tree stump in question. It looked solid at first, but when he reached out to touch it, his hand passed through the surface. An illusion. He carefully extended his arm further and revealed a hidden trapdoor beneath the projected image. The source of the illusion was a crystal, which he pocketed for future use after the projection faded away. Thomas tied up Zora, Zirath and Thalia with loose knots, shaking his head as he sized them up. The absurdity of one man being able to capture and hold 3 adventurers, 2 of whom were towering, heavily muscled warriors, was not lost on him. He decided to keep that thought to himself. With the group ready, he opened the trapdoor and led them down a steep, winding staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. The air grew warmer and more oppressive the deeper they descended. The faint sound of voices and clinking dishes reached their ears, growing louder as they approached the end of the stairway. At last, they entered a large, dimly lit chamber. The walls were solid stone, expertly crafted, likely the work of engineers who had quietly added yet another hidden tunnel to Bridgerton's labyrinthine infrastructure. Thomas could see the telltale signs of corruption everywhere. No one had questioned the construction of such a tunnel system, because this was just one of many that blended into the city's vast underbelly. At the bottom of the stairs, a guard stood by the entrance, another man in city uniform. That spelled trouble. The guard raised an eyebrow as he looked at Thomas, then at the imposing prisoners behind him. Thomas felt the weight of the guard's suspicion but kept his composure. Thinking quickly, he put on an air of smug superiority, boasting about how fierce he must be to have captured such dangerous individuals. The guard snorted, shook his head and shrugged it off, waving them through. Thomas couldn't help but marvel at his luck. If only his dice rolls were this kind to him. Inside, however, the good fortune quickly ran out. The room was packed with over a dozen thugs, crooked guards, and shady characters. The air was thick with smoke and the rowdy sounds of men drinking and laughing loudly. The group drew a few curious glances, but for the moment no outright hostility. Thomas made his way toward a door at the back of the chamber, keeping his head down and his posture confident. He approached another guard stationed there, a sergeant by the looks of him, and explained that he needed access to the vaults. The sergeant gave him a hard stare and asked for the password. Thomas hesitated. His mind scrambled for something plausible, but no luck came to his rescue this time. He stammered out a string of half-formed words, clearly floundering. The sergeant's eyes narrowed suspiciously. The moment stretched uncomfortably. Then the silence shattered. Someone in the room shouted, demanding to know what was going on. Suspicion swept across the crowd like wildfire. Patrons and guards rose to their feet, weapons being drawn, and voices escalated into a chorus of shouts. All hell broke loose. The room erupted in chaos as Thomas fumbled the password. The sergeant shouted an order, and thugs scrambled for cover, loading crossbows and drawing blades. Zora roared as he tore through his restraints, snapping the ropes with ease. Thalia followed suit, her hands already glowing with eldritch energy. The first blast she fired struck a thug mid-step, sending him sprawling to the floor. Across the chamber, crossbow bolts hissed through the smoky air, one slicing across Zora's shoulder. Zora cursed under his breath, grabbing the weapons pack and flipping a table onto its side for cover. He pulled out his longsword, its polished blade gleaming even in the dim light, and threw the others' weapons their way. He gave a sharp nod and prepared for the onslaught. Zirath, already armed, deflected a crossbow bolt with his axe. Without a word, he inhaled deeply and unleashed a torrent of fire. The flames swept across a group of thugs reloading their weapons, reducing them to screams and ash. The inferno lit the room, momentarily halting the fight as even his companions stared at him in shock. They had never seen Zirath reveal his true draconic nature like this. But the fight was far from over. Bolts and blades clashed in a brutal melee. Thalia moved like a shadow, firing more eldritch blasts that cut through the smoke. A bolt grazed her leg, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving, striking down another thug. Zora charged from cover, swinging his sword in wide, brutal arcs. He cut through one thug's defense with a single strike and shoved another to the ground with a powerful kick, but not before a bolt embedded itself in his thigh. He yanked it out, barely slowing his momentum. Zirath fought with relentless precision, slashing through enemy after enemy. A blade found its mark, slicing deep into his side, but he barely flinched. Fueled by fury, he pressed on, his axe striking with deadly efficiency. Meanwhile, Thomas locked onto the sergeant, blasting him with bursts of dark energy. The sergeant staggered but stood his ground, snarling until a final bolt of eldritch force sent him crashing to the floor. The fight became a savage blur. Thugs and guards fell in droves, but the adventurers weren't unscathed. Blood stained their armor and dripped onto the stone floor. Every movement was a desperate dance between life and death, the tight quarters leaving little room for error. Finally, the last enemy fell. The room was a ruin of shattered furniture and broken bodies, smoke and blood filling the air. The group stood panting, battered but victorious. Each bore wounds, but their eyes burned with determination. Whatever lay beyond the door had better be worth the price they'd paid. Zora knelt over the fallen sergeant and rifled through his belongings, eventually pulling a ring of keys from the man's belt. Without a word, he passed them to Thomas, who walked over to the door at the back of the chamber. One of the larger keys slid into the lock with a heavy clunk, and the door groaned open, revealing yet another spiraling stone staircase, descending deep into the earth. The group exchanged wary glances before stepping inside. The air grew cooler and damp as they descended. The walls seemed to vibrate faintly with the sound of rushing water, likely part of the hidden channels that powered Bridgerton's locks and dams. The eerie quiet was broken only by their footsteps echoing off the smooth stone steps. After what felt like an eternity of descent, they came upon another door. Thomas unlocked it with another key from the ring, and they pushed it open cautiously. Inside was an armory, row upon row of weapons neatly organized on racks. Simple blades, martial weapons, shields, and even crossbows were stacked in alarming numbers. Enough to outfit an entire brigade. Thomas scanned the room and whistled softly. He muttered something about how anyone armed with this stockpile could hold the northern trade routes and this very bridge with ease. This wasn't about gold. It was something bigger, something political. He scowled, clearly displeased. Politics meant complicated schemes and long-term investments, which, as he quietly lamented, rarely paid as well as a straightforward heist. He muttered about how he hated politics, too much work for too little reward. The group searched the armory but found nothing they didn't already possess or need. There were no signs of vaults or hidden treasures, only the unsettling implication of something being prepared on a massive scale. With nothing left to explore, they continued downward. The stairway stretched on endlessly, winding deep into the bowels of the earth. The sound of rushing water faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, faintly, voices echoed from below. The adventurers halted and exchanged tense looks. Slowly, they crept forward, the voices becoming clearer as they neared another bend in the staircase. Two people were speaking. Their tones were serious, almost conspiratorial. The group moved carefully, their footsteps light on the worn stone steps, straining to hear the conversation without revealing their presence. The words became clearer, and what they heard made their blood run cold. The Thieves' Guild captain spoke with a tone of cold certainty, mentioning that preparations had been made as planned. The local guard had been bought off, just as instructed, and even soldiers were now on their payroll. More than enough to deter any curious eyes from interfering. From within the shimmering portal at the center of the room, a low, crackling voice responded, laced with unnatural menace. The air around it hummed ominously, as the voice inquired about the weapons cache. The captain confirmed that the cache was ready, waiting for the command to act. She added that the scheduled dam repairs provided the perfect cover for their operation. No one suspected that those repairs were part of a larger plan, to choke off trade from the north all the way to Central City by blocking the bridge. It was a strategy that would cripple commerce and force the region into submission. The voice praised the captain's progress, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The captain hesitated briefly, lowering her voice as she cautiously ventured into more dangerous territory. She mentioned rumours from her informants, whispers of a Vestran orb, and asked if that was how they intended to keep the cities under control after the blockade was established. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. The portal crackled violently, and the voice hardened with icy fury. The unseen figure made it clear the question had crossed a line. The captain was warned, in no uncertain terms, never to speak of the orb again. There was something dangerous, almost otherworldly, in the voice's tone, and it sent a shiver down the captain's spine. Beads of sweat formed on her brow as she hastily backtracked, stammering assurances that she would not ask again. She acknowledged her place and swore her obedience. Hidden in the shadows, Zora stiffened, his body tense with recognition. The voice, he knew it. It belonged to Professor Vorenthala, the figure behind so many of their past trials. Rage, a true barbarian's rage, surged through him like a tidal wave. Without warning, Zora charged, smashing through the thick wooden door like paper. The portal flickered violently as the professor's scowling face came into view for a brief moment before the gateway snapped shut. He had sneered at Zora, with a look of arrogant annoyance. Zora, in his fury, turned to the other target in the room. The female bandit wizard standing before the portal reacted instantly, her hands already moving through the motions of a spell. Flames roared to life as she hurled a fireball straight toward Zora. Zora gritted his teeth and braced himself for impact. The fight had begun. The rest of the adventurers burst into the room, their weapons and spells ready. They found Zora staggering, blood dripping from his many wounds as he squared off against the bandit wizard. Had they all been inside when the fireball had gone off, they might not have survived. The room's cold, solid stone walls bore no scorch marks despite the violent magic. Everything had been contained. And now it was a deadly fight to the finish. The wizard's face was a mixture of fury and fear. She knew she was cornered but wasn't going to go down easily. With a sharp incantation, she summoned a shimmering wall of force that cut across the room, halting most of the group's initial attacks. Blades, spells, and arrows struck the barrier harmlessly, leaving them cursing under their breath as they reoriented themselves. Thalia's keen senses picked up on something in the wizard's movements. The spell had been cast hastily, a desperate attempt to buy time. Thalia deduced that the wizard was low on arcane power. Perhaps the previous fireball and portal magic had drained her reserves. Still, desperation made her dangerous. The wizard launched spell after spell with deadly precision, bolts of arcane energy crackling through the air like streaks of lightning. A bolt of force grazed Zirath's armor, leaving a dent and forcing him to step back. Another spell clipped Thomas, sending him sprawling into a pillar with a pained grunt. Thalia darted between columns, loosing eldritch blasts that forced the wizard onto the defensive. Despite her weakening state, the wizard raised shield spells with impressive speed, dulling the force of each attack or deflecting blows entirely. Her eyes burned with defiance, but the strain was evident. Her breathing grew laboured, her spellwork less precise. Zora, wounded but unrelenting, roared and charged the barrier. The sword in his hand gleamed as he struck, the sheer force of his blow causing a crack to ripple through the invisible wall. The wizard's eyes widened as she saw her defences faltering. Zirath followed with another brutal strike, his axe shattering the remnants of the force barrier like glass. With nowhere left to run, the wizard summoned a final shield spell, but it was weaker now, flickering like a dying flame. The adventurers closed in, striking in coordinated fury. Thomas's eldritch blasts ripped into her defences, forcing her backward. Thalia's dark magic struck true, knocking the staff from the wizard's hands. The wizard screamed in defiance as Zirath delivered the final blow, his axe cleaving through her weakened shield and into her chest. The room fell silent, except for the heavy breaths of the adventurers and the metallic clatter of the wizard's staff hitting the stone floor. They stood over the fallen body, bloodied and exhausted but victorious. Thalia looked down at the wizard's lifeless face, noting the fear and desperation frozen in her features. Whatever she and the professor had been planning, it had been on the verge of execution. The fight might have been won, but the mystery of the Vestran orb and the conspiracy surrounding the bridge still loomed over them. Zora wiped the blood from his sword and exchanged a weary glance with Zirath. The group began searching the chamber, sifting through the remnants of their fierce battle. Among the scattered debris, they found a small payroll chest filled with coin. Nothing substantial, just enough to keep the operation's hired thugs paid. Thomas groaned, running a hand through his hair in frustration. He muttered bitterly about how months of scheming had led to nothing more than a cache of mundane steel weapons and a few meagre coins. There was no wealth here worth fencing, certainly not the payoff he had envisioned. Then Zora noticed something unusual. Along the left wall of the chamber stood a single massive stone slab, perfectly smooth and clearly different from the rest of the room's rough stonework. The party gathered around it, each realizing the same thing. This was likely the vault door they had heard about. It made sense now. This place was a staging ground, a way to move hordes of weapons through hidden passages under the bridge and through the canals and waterways. Thomas marvelled at the level of corruption months in the making. At the far reaches of his soul, his patron stirred. As they stood before the door, the weight of their situation pressed down on them. The corruption traced all the way back to the guard captain. He had erased any higher connections from the evidence Thalia had uncovered, leaving them with no clear authority to turn to. With the captain dead and their cover blown, there was no one in power they could trust to take the evidence without risking their own necks. Thomas kicked a nearby crate in frustration, grumbling about the sheer waste of time and effort. No treasure, no payout, just more problems. Zirath reminded him that they were far from safe. The events of the card game and the destruction of the water pump station had likely spread by now. Both the corrupt guards and those loyal to the captain would be on high alert and hunting for them. Thalia nodded grimly. They were out of options in Bridgerton. The group made their decision swiftly. They would leave the city immediately and head for the only place that might offer safety and answers, the White Tower of Mistra in Inkwell. Frizz had been working with the professor on something important, and with any luck, it would be news they could use. The wilds would be their best route to avoid detection, staying off the main roads and bypassing any patrols. Thomas sighed but reluctantly agreed. If anyone had a plan worth following now, it was his unlikely band of companions. They gathered what little they could carry and prepared to vanish into the wilderness. Each of them carried wounds, both physical and mental, but there was no time to rest. Bridgerton was behind them, and their next steps would take them deeper into the unravelling mystery of the Vestran orbs and the hidden forces that sought to control the province. All they could hope for now was that Inkwell held better news than they had found here. We leave our heroes today making a run for Inkwell, along with a new friend, Thomas the Warlock. Until next time, adventurers.